provide the forms, we provide the property management hotline, and so many other things. And so we hope that you're taking advantage of those, because really the goal is that we would have the most successful group of apartment owners here in the state of California. And so stay informed, keep sharpening that axe, and we just hope that we're able to make things easier and more profitable for you. And if you need closed captions, you can go to the Facebook channel, the AOA USA Facebook channel, and catch that. And you know, there's you may have missed Dennis Block talking about the way to find a good tenant. And if you have a 3-year membership, very shortly, in short order, we will have that video up for you in your member account. And it will not be on YouTube, but it will be in your member account under the videos tab, or under the free gifts tab, actually, excuse me. Under the free gifts tab, there's some links to different reports. And whether you're 1, 2, or 3-year member, that free gifts, if you look under resources, the free gifts tab has links to free reports and videos that you may have access to depending on whether you're 1, 2, or 3-year member. Anyway, we'll have that up in short order, and that was a great time. So you may have missed that one. Today at noon, we have the how to protect. It's protecting your rental property and why earthquake insurance is important, why it's a good idea. And so you'll want to listen to that. Next week, we're going to be talking ADA compliance, and specifically the access routes and exactly what the specs on those are. And again, just something to keep you in the know. And then also next week, San Diego has a big legislative update. It is the residential tenant protection ordinance that went into effect. And so they call it RTP. And maybe it should be more like RIP, because no more Mr. Nice Guy as far as just how you work with tenants. You're going to be nice, of course, they're your clients, but man, you can't give people the same breaks that you used to give them just because of all the laws that they're heaping on top of us that are just so anti-rental property owner. And so that's next week. We'll get Franco Simone in, and he'll share with us, hopefully, a lot and kind of unpack that ordinance. So if you're interested in this type of content, definitely subscribe. If you're an AOA member, you should subscribe, because if you miss the email, at least when you're subscribed and you have that notification bell hit, at least you'll be getting it. If you're watching this on the AOAUSA.com website, this is available after the fact on YouTube. Our YouTube channel name is AOA USA. So if you just type that in as one word, then we'll come up and you'll be able to browse and see what other videos we've produced for you. And so shout out to our sponsor today, Real Estate Transition Solutions, and they are your real estate investment advisory firm expert. And so definitely thankful for them. I think they have 4 offices on the West Coast now. And anyway, they do 220 yearly in replacement properties. And anyway, so very thankful for them. And our speaker today is a partner at Real Estate Transition Solutions. He's been in the real estate industry all of his life. He's a 2nd generation guy. He's a CPA by education, worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he's been with the firm there at least for 6.5 years, probably more by now. But it's my pleasure to introduce to you Austin Bowlin.
Community, appreciate you for hosting us. As mentioned, my name is Austin Bowlin. I'm a partner here at Real Estate Transition Solutions. And today's webinar topic is how experts uncover high potential 1031 DST investment properties. And specifically, what we're going to be discussing is what our firm's due diligence process consists of when evaluating Delaware statutory trusts as 1031 exchange replacement properties for the clients whom we work with. Now, the Delaware statutory trust that we're going to be discussing the due diligence process of today is both 1031 exchange eligible as like-kind real estate, but also a registered security with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And there is a requirement that in order to invest in Delaware statutory trust property, one must be what's considered an accredited investor. Typically, that means having a net worth in excess of $1 million, not including the value of your primary residence. What we're going to be covering today is a brief refresh on what the Delaware Statutory Trust is, for those whom this may be a new concept for. And then we'll dive into the due diligence process. Who performs due diligence? What does due diligence consist of? Why is due diligence important? And then wrap it up with some additional 1031 exchange educational resources and Q&A at the end of our time together. A little bit of background on our firm, Real Estate Transition Solutions. We, as you may know, are a real estate advisory firm that focuses on serving property owners who are navigating the transition from the third to the fourth quarter of property ownership. And broadly speaking, what that often entails is an individual or family or an entity with business partners in which one owns and often either actively manages or oversees third-party property management of properties that are highly appreciated. They've increased in value over the years and decades of ownership. And those owners are looking at their investment real estate and saying, it may not be the best fit with my both financial and lifestyle objectives moving forward. That could be because of the time spent managing the property. It could be the changing regulatory environment. It could be because of deferred maintenance or wanting to have a different return structure, maybe more income focus, or starting to think about estate planning. The work we do is to come alongside those property owners, discuss and ultimately determine what those objectives are, the framework through which we're going to evaluate any potential strategies and options, and then build a transition strategy and do so on a tax-deferred basis. It's very popular for that to entail selling real estate and performing a tax-deferred 1031 exchange into Delaware statutory trusts, given the number of benefits associated with DST ownership. One of the elements that is particularly unique about our firm is the amount of time and energy that we have invested into our due diligence department and invest into every individual property that we ultimately make available to the clients whom we're working with. The firm was founded just over 20 years ago by my father, Roger Bowlin. He began his career in traditional commercial real estate brokerage, followed by about 2.5 decades in wealth management. And it was during that period of time where he really saw the need and built the company such to serve the need of those who need financial planning lens taken to their investment real estate with tax strategy layered on top of that. I joined the firm about 7 years ago at this point. I'm a CPA by background, and previous to working here at RETS, was at a large public accounting firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, first in their audit practice, followed by their mergers and acquisitions advisory group. So to establish that baseline knowledge, for those of you who the Delaware Statutory Trust is a new term or concept, what a DST is it's an ownership structure. Similar in that an LLC or an S Corp or limited partnership, all of those are also ownership structures. But what's particularly unique about it is that it allows for an individual to sell investment real estate and perform that tax-deferred 1031 exchange into owning what's referred to as a fractional interest, also known as percentage ownership, of substantially larger institutional quality property. Now, when we talk about and use the term institutional quality property, what I mean by that are properties that are of the size and quality that you would typically see being acquired by the likes of, say, a real estate investment trust or a pension plan or a university endowment, maybe a sovereign wealth fund or a large family office. Very commonly, these are anywhere from, say, $30 to $250 million properties or portfolios of multiple properties. Most DSTs are property type specific. So whether they own a single asset or a portfolio, they'll typically only own one property type. And what that does is, by us working with an exchanger, it really allows for the ability to build a portfolio of multiple different DSTs with property types included in that portfolio that are specific for that exchanger's objectives. And whether that's entirely multifamily portfolio or whether that has a blend of, say, corporate guaranteed net lease retail and industrial and senior housing and multifamily. There's a near limitless number of ways in which one can mix and match and design a portfolio to really cater to that particular exchanger. Those DST properties, once invested in, are typically owned for 5 to 7 years. They're income producing for the investors, generally distributing income on a monthly basis. And then eventually that property is sold. And once sold, all of the investors receive their pro rata share of the sales proceeds and can continue to exchange and thus defer their tax liability, which most investors into DSTs do, until eventually they or their spouse pass away and that step up in basis is realized. So all that deferred tax over the years and decades of ownership and quite possibly multiple 1031 exchanges is then eliminated for that surviving spouse and then eliminated again for those beneficiaries. There are a number of benefits associated with DST ownership, really not the intent of today's presentation. So this is just a broad overview listing out a handful of those benefits. But if this is something in which you're interested in learning more about, would very much encourage you to reach out directly to us or join us for one of our more DST-focused webinars speaking about the attributes and characteristics of Delaware statutory trusts. Now, with that background, the due diligence process is ultimately what is going to dictate what properties end up being approved and made available to exchangers whom we are working with. And it's something in which we're very proud of. As I mentioned before, it's unique in the amount that we have invested in our due diligence team. We have a team of 5 individuals who all they do is underwrite institutional real estate sponsors, the companies that put these investments together, and the underlying real estate itself. And originally, we were going to have this presentation be hosted by Monica Parikh, our director of due diligence. But unfortunately, she actually had a last-minute due diligence trip that came up that she needed to go on down to Atlanta to meet with a DST sponsor and then Huntsville, Alabama to tour 2 properties and get to know that market in a more intimate way. Why due diligence is important is because ultimately that process is where we are able to identify the opportunities associated with an investment, the risks associated with an investment, and then what mitigants are in place, what is there intentionally to address those risks, and determine whether or not we feel comfortable with the, call it, balance between those opportunities and risks. And it's worth noting, it almost goes without saying, that all investments do present a certain level of risk associated with them. But that being said, the Delaware Statutory Trust is really intended to first focus on preservation of capital, second, delivering stable, predictable income for the investors, and then third, generating what we would consider to be moderate appreciation. So with that lens, we approach the due diligence process and ultimately making that call of, do we see opportunity that outweighs the risk, and what is the risk profile with the investment? The due diligence process also allows us to get to know the unique attributes and characteristics of the property and the structure and the investment thesis, so that when our team of exchange advisors are communicating with property owners and they are learning the individual's objectives, lifestyle, financial, estate planning, etc., the right recommendations can be provided to them, marrying together the objectives with those particular investments. Now, due diligence is not performed by a single entity in the Delaware Statutory Trust process. There's a number of groups that are going to be doing a very comprehensive review and analysis of the property. It starts with the DST sponsor, who will first be identifying the property and then going through their acquisition process. And one of the elements that's unique about the DST structure is that that sponsor is actually going to acquire the property first using their own balance sheet. meaning they have to feel comfortable owning that property in its entirety before there are any investors that have exchanged into that particular property. That forms a nice layer of accountability, if you will, in the acquisition process. While that property is under contract, typically after it's non-refundable, RETS, our firm, steps in and begins their due diligence process. And this is going all the way through the contract period as information is becoming available. And we're also pulling our own independent analysis for certain components that we'll discuss a little bit later. And then also carries beyond the close date of the property, typically for 1 or 2 weeks. And then a third-party due diligence firm is almost always going to be commissioned to write their own independent report on the property. And they're going to be looking at the fundamentals of the property, but also the structure of the trust and comparing that to industry standards and attesting to whether or not they feel like that DST's structure is reasonable and consistent with what's typically seen in today's environment. Once our due diligence process begins, there are multiple steps associated with it. Before we look at any individual property, though, the due diligence focuses on the sponsor, the company that it has acquired the real estate, structured the trust, and manages the property on behalf of the investors, ultimately ending in a sale of that property. And sponsor level due diligence is critical because the sponsors make all of the operating decisions for the property over the life of the DST. We're about 57 DST sponsors that structured investments in 2022. The last year we have full year data for. Of those, we've approved 19 of those individual sponsors. And I would say on average, assets under management of a sponsor we work with is about $4.5 billion. So these are not small operators by any stretch of the imagination. And commonly, they will also be investing on behalf of pensions, or they will have a REIT that they manage and have other ownership structures that they work with as well. From sponsor level due diligence as an entity, the focus really shifts over to the investment thesis and the business plan for that sponsor. And should we decide to approve a particular sponsor, then we'll begin specific property analysis. And just because we've approved the sponsor does not, by any stretch of the imagination, mean we'll approve every single property that they put forward. We understand that real estate is local, it's specific, there's unique attributes associated with every market, every property, and we will take it on a case-by-case basis as to which individual properties will make it through that due diligence process. Whenever we're evaluating a property, there's always going to be a very granular neighborhood analysis and larger market analysis. And we'll talk more about what those steps entail. It's going to be different depending on what property type in which we're looking at. The process for industrial is very much different than the process for, say, multifamily. We'll also go through a tenant analysis, whether that's review of a particular commercial tenant, maybe a publicly traded investment grade company, or it could be a lease audit of all of the residents in the building if we're talking about, say, a 285 unit apartment building. And then we'll review the third party reports, property condition report, inspection report, the flood zone maps, the insurance policies that are in place, the loan terms, et cetera, when wrapping up our due diligence process. Sponsor level due diligence, as I mentioned, is critical. And what we're looking at really is track record. Is that track record large enough and long enough standing that it's meaningful for us, which typically means predating the last recession. And when I say last recession, I'm not talking about COVID 2020. I'm talking about the great financial crisis. Because with the exception of commercial office and hospitality, COVID in large part did not at a macro level impact most property type classifications. Whereas the great financial crisis was an equal opportunity recession, if you will, and was a very difficult time to be acquiring, managing, and navigating real estate ownership and management. So we want to see how properties performed during that period of time. What sort of decisions did the sponsor make? Were they investor-centric? Was there proactive communication occurring throughout that period of time? We don't expect to see the same returns of a property that was purchased in, say, 2006 as we do a property purchase in 2014. But it's very important to us to know what occurred during that period of time. Continuity of management, number of assets under management or amount of assets under management, outstanding litigation against the sponsor as a company, all of that gets taken into account at the sponsor level due diligence stage. If a sponsor is approved, then we move to looking at individual properties. And here it's all about acquisition terms, value relative to comparables in the market, projected financials, rental growth, expense growth, et cetera. And then how that property fits within the market and what that market's long-term prognosis is. So I'll use a multifamily example here so it's most relatable for today's listeners. But when we're looking at a market analysis, we're very much focused on, one, who are the employers? Two, in the surrounding area, are those growing industries? Is there diversification among the industries that they represent? We're hesitant about concentrated cities where there may be one key industry represented, but there's not diversification there. Are we seeing a strong demographic trend of people moving in? What's the median income? What are multifamily rents in that market relative to home values and ultimately the monthly cost of home ownership? Are we seeing new supply, effectively properties under construction that are going to be delivering new units in the pipeline? And what's been that market's historic absorption rate? How quickly do those units get leased up and fully occupied? Or are we seeing a scenario where concessions may have to be offered, or rents may fall and occupancy may fall when those new projects are developed? All of that's taken into account, including then the exit analysis of when that property is sold, what sort of returns could we see being achievable based off of the projected income growth, expense growth, and ultimately how that translates to net operating income. Those financial projections are always going to be stress tested. What happens if they outperform the financial projections, achieve the financial projections, come short of the financial projections, and how does that translate from an investor return standpoint? What we're looking at here more than anything else is downside protection. How bad could things get and still have a full return of principal for the investors as our base case scenario? When we're looking at those projections, fortunately, most of the sponsors whom we work with tend to put pretty conservative projections forward, which then allows a scenario where achievable projections are presented. And if they exceed that, the investors capture the increase in income. And that's required in the Delaware statutory trust structure. So everyone benefits from that. And then ultimately, everyone is pleasantly surprised with that return. What you'll see here is just a quick glimpse at some of the third-party research and data that we're able to pull when evaluating a property. So this is using CoStar and Oxford Economics. And this gives you a feel for looking at a particular market and sub-market, focusing specifically on what's referred to as 4- and 5-star multifamily properties. Most would call this Class A and Class B multifamily properties. And what is the current vacancy in that market? What are the current asking rents? What was the peak vacancy that we saw, and what was that period of time in which that occurred? What sort of new permitted construction are we going to see being delivered and anticipated? Knowing that not all of these projects are ultimately going to be built and delivered. But one of the really nice components about multifamily specifically is the fact that it really takes about 3 years to identify a site, file permits, ultimately build the structure, and then begin the lease-up phase. So we have quite a bit of visibility into what the supply and demand equation is going to look like from a supply side when evaluating a property in the context of a particular market. Now, one of the advantages of working with a firm such as ours is, one, that we have invested heavily in the due diligence and feel confident, and history has shown that due diligence has translated to meaningful and consistent returns for the investors. The second is that because of the amount of equity that's placed, the amount of dollars invested with many of these sponsors, we have a very different relationship with the sponsors where it's much more collaborative, and they are asking us, is there appetite for this particular property type or this market or this structure. And we're able to share with them, hey, we're hearing from exchangers, people don't really want to be investing in commercial office right now. Not that there's not money to be made there, but that the risk profile may be too high and it doesn't really fit with the set of objectives of the property owner profile we typically work with. Additionally, it's what allows for us to get large blocks of equity that we can make available to exchangers. And when we decide to not approve of a particular property, that sends a message to a sponsor. That might mean $5, $10, $15 million of equity that our clients would have otherwise invested in that property. And they're asking us, why did you not approve it? What didn't you like about that particular property or that market? And that creates a feedback loop and accountability so that we can continue to see a critical acquisition process, sponsors being willing to be patient and judicious in purchasing their properties and making them available to the exchangers whom we are working with. We recognize that a sale and a 1031 exchange into a Delaware statutory trust is very much a meaningful financial decision for any client that we work with. And we look at it really from a stewardship standpoint. We are the closest ones to these properties that are unbiased in terms of providing recommendations. And we value that relationship with the exchangers whom we represent and work on behalf of. So we know that it is important for us to be critical of the properties. We're looking for reasons to say no. And typically there is a very good reason as to why we have elected not to approve a particular property or decided to approve a property and make it available. What that leads to is what we feel confident are the best possible DSTs that are appropriate for a particular exchanger being made available as recommendations and then the investment seen through. So in short, the due diligence process as a whole is really intended to know what are the unique attributes of an investment opportunity, what are the opportunities associated with that, what are the risks associated with that, and do we feel comfortable with the return profile and the opportunities outweighing those risks. That's our goal. And our goal is to consistently deliver stable, predictable returns for investors. I'm not a big baseball guy myself, but I often liken this to we want to hit singles and doubles every single time. And sometimes we're going to end up hitting a triple or a home run, and our track record is certainly attested to that fact. But that's a pleasant surprise. We're not stretching for that. We're not underwriting for that because, frankly, when you swing for the fences, your strikeout rate goes up as well. That's not the intent of the DST, and that's not the lens through which we approach our due diligence process. So why work with an exchange advisor? It's to gain the expertise of firms like ours in terms of the due diligence and the understanding and knowledge about the sponsors and the properties. It's to have someone walking alongside of you who is very experienced in extracting objectives, building a framework, and then making informed decisions and recommendations based off of those objectives. It's knowing the mechanics and the timeline and the rules associated with 1031 exchanges, so there's no misstepping that occurs. And it's looping your other advisors in, having open channels of communication so that your estate planning attorney, your CPA, your financial advisor, all have a seat at the table and can weigh in on the transaction. As far as additional educational resources go, we just launched about 6 weeks ago our guide to 1031 exchanges, upgrading your 1031 exchange for California property owners. This is a fantastic resource in which all the information is really specific to California property owners. I mean, you can access the guide for download free, complimentary, by scanning the QR code that you see here on the slide, or by visiting our AOA hub, which is re-transition.com/AOA. Specifically focusing on the Delaware Statutory Trust, we also have our guide to investing in DSTs, another great resource for learning more about the history, the structure, the application, and the number of strategies available using Delaware Statutory Trust replacement property. And for those of you who may be interested in seeing more granular information at the property level, properties that have made it through our due diligence process, you can visit our marketplace. Again, that can be accessed through our AOA hub, but that's re-transition.com/AOA. And then webinars are a near weekly occurrence, both through AOA and then hosted on our own. And then a great way for those who are more verbal and visual to learn about the strategies, the rigor of the due diligence process, different subcategories of DSTs, comparing and contrasting property types and the like. And if you have any specific questions or are interested in discussing your own situation, we are always happy to have a conversation with the property owner or one of their advisors. The best way to do so is by sending us an email, calling into the office. Our headquarters are up here in Seattle, Washington, where I'm physically located, but we have offices in San Francisco and Orange County and Portland as well. But that complimentary consultation can happen in person. It can happen over the phone. It can happen via video conferencing, whatever medium you prefer. Well, that's our overview here. I'm going to hand it back over to Jeff so we can dive into some Q&A if any questions came through.
Great. Thank you so much. There we go. And thank you so much for sharing that. I'm curious what you think. And guys, if now is a perfect time to put your questions in. If you're watching from AOAUSA.com, there's the blue help button at the bottom right side of the page. You can put your question in there. And of course, Facebook and YouTube, you know what to do. So just to get started here, you talked about the sponsor companies and just how important it is in the due diligence process that they go through. What do you think is more important, the location or the sponsor company?
Oh, that's a good question. It starts with the sponsor for us. So if we're not confident in the sponsor, given that they are going to be making all the decisions at the property level, capital budget, leasing strategy, third-party vendors that are being used, whether it's property management or maintenance and landscaping, whatever it may be, they are the first step in the due diligence process. And if we're not comfortable with the sponsor, it's a non-starter. I mean, we don't really care how good of a purchase they made, how good of a market the property they acquired was. If we don't feel comfortable with them as an operator, then we're not moving forward. So from that point, should we feel comfortable with a sponsor? And ideally, in most situations, the sponsors whom we've worked with for over a decade or more. Then at that point, the market itself is also critical. So it's, one comes before the other, and one is not going to, if we don't feel comfortable with that sponsor, we're not even going to look at the individual properties. But should we feel comfortable with the sponsor, then absolutely. The physical structure is critical. The acquisition terms are critical. Every step in the due diligence process, and this was a quick overview in Synops, every step presents opportunities for deal breakers. So we're not going to overlook something, and the market certainly being one of those items that, of course, could not be overlooked.
Great. And on YouTube, there's William, and he has the question, has the IRS published a document regarding the validity of DSTs? And so I think he's just looking for court ruling or something tangible that he could maybe search up online or a link that we could drop in that, so it's not just I think he's not just going to take our word for it, but he wants to look at something. What do you have for us?
As a CPA, I entirely appreciate that healthy skepticism there. And just to give a little bit of context, when we look at the tiers of authority and codification from an IRS standpoint, what it starts with is the actual IRC, Internal Revenue Code. This is the tax code. It doesn't get touched very often. We saw comprehensive tax code reform in 2017 through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Previous to that, it had been over 30 years since the mid-'80s where we saw a true overhaul of the tax code. So that's not something that happens every administration. It's a big lift. It takes years to push something like that through Congress. But you have the tax code itself. That's really the gold standard, 10 commandments, if you will. But obviously, there's much more than just 10 in there. Below that, you have what are referred to as revenue rulings. And revenue rulings are as strong or as solidified as tax code, but they are releases that happen on an annual basis from the IRS of them often clarifying specific situations or speaking to components that were not large enough to make it into the actual tax code itself, a more specific scenario, or something that maybe is new too. Like take crypto, for instance. Like they never saw it before. There wasn't even a concept of that when the tax reform in the 80s was done. So they might release some revenue rulings that speak to some of that newness. Below that, we have case precedent. And that's where we've seen the tax courts take a position on a particular situation. And that's drawn upon by tax attorneys as setting a precedent moving forward. Now, sometimes those cases are conflicting. So there's some interpretation that needs to be done there. But that's where tax opinion letters often come into play. And then the lowest standard in terms of comfort and guidance, and something in which one probably should be very, very careful relying upon, is going to be what's called a private letter ruling. And that's a specifically requested letter from the IRS by a taxpayer to opine on a situation. But the IRS is very careful in saying, when we bless something or say something isn't allowable, whatever their position may be, or kind of take a middle ground hedge stance, that's not to be used for other instances, for other transactions. That is specifically to Jeff's question or Austin's question, whatever it may be. That's the context right there, those 4 tiers: tax code, revenue rulings, case precedent, private letter rulings. In 2004, the IRS released a revenue ruling that supports and blesses the Delaware Statutory Trust as 1031 exchange eligible. That's Revenue Ruling 2004-86. And so from that point forward, there's been a significant amount of transaction volume, of course, but also it's widely recognized as this is now effectively part of our tax code as it stands today. And every DST that we work with will have a tax opinion letter commissioned, but that tax opinion letter is not determining whether or not the DST as a structure is eligible for exchanges. It is this specific DST meeting the requirements that the IRS put forward?
All right, so that's Revenue Ruling 2004-86.
You got it. If anyone wants to read some tax code this afternoon, that would be the place to start.
So there it is. Go search it up. All right, Susie on YouTube. What is the cost to use RETS, R-E-T-S? She might be meaning REITs, or she might mean Delaware Statutory Trust.
I mean, that's the acronym for our company's name, for RETS. So.
Oh, okay. There we go. She knows what she's doing.
Yep. And it's good to hear that being used out in the wild, because we refer to our company as RETS internally, but most people go for the whole sentence name, if you will. Good question. So, our compensation structure is exactly analogous to as if one was to work with a commercial real estate broker or a residential real estate agent, depending on the property type in which you're acquiring, as buyer's representation. And what I mean by that is we can receive a commission for representing the investor. We work for the investor. That's who our obligation is to. And it's consistent with commercial real estate brokerage, typically right around 2.5% of replacement property value acquired, paid by the seller. Just like when someone's turning around and selling their single family home or their 20-unit apartment building or anything in between, the seller is paying their seller's representation and the buyer's representation. Same thing for the DST. The DST sponsors, technically the seller, they're paying for buyer's representation, and they don't have seller's representation because they don't need it.
Great.
So it's not an out-of-pocket expense for the investor.
Great. And by the way, for those of you that are in the LA area, we do have a brokerage, and you can get a free property valuation. And that's just part of us being around. Yeah, we've been doing brokerage for longer than AOA existed. So here we are. But all right, the next question is from Q or K, I'm not sure. Is it required to sell and buy in the same state?
No. In fact, many do not, and most do not with the Delaware Statutory Trust. So, when it is required in order to do a 1031 exchange for it to be domestic real estate. It has to be physically located within the United States. And surprisingly, and it's not worth diving into this, but some territories are allowable to exchange into, some are not. Don't ask me why they're not all allowable, but anyway, it does have to be domestic real estate, but there are no limitations as to which state the property is in. And that tax deferral that you receive, you sell a property, is going to be inclusive of all of your federal income tax, or federal tax, so your capital gain, your depreciation recapture, your net investment income tax, as well as any state tax that would be due. The only tax that is typically not deferrable is going to be an excise tax if the county, municipality, state in which someone's selling a property ends up having an excise tax associated.
All right, Christopher, he had the same question as Susie. I think we answered it though. What's your cost structure? We already did that. You answered that one. And then Sue here, can you provide sample analysis spreadsheets? So
yes and no. So we have to be careful with that. And when we look at the due diligence process, what I'll say is that there's more work happening on our team than one probably even knows or hears about. And that there's good reason as to why that's the case. But that being said, we can't turn over our due diligence files from a liability standpoint. Now, we are always happy to facilitate a conversation with anyone on our due diligence team, with our director of due diligence, certainly connecting with the acquisitions team at the sponsor level, if that would be helpful. It's not uncommon to do property visits for those who really want to put boots on the ground and see a property. Our team may have already seen it, but we'll go with an investor if that's something that would be helpful for them. But we can't just turn over all the files, unfortunately. And we can summarize information, we can talk through it, but we can't just say, hey, here's access to our due diligence SharePoint.
So when you're giving them the different options, how big is the report that you're going to give them? So it may not be all the due diligence documents, but what would they expect to be included in a report for them to look at for a specific investment?
So they'll get a full prospectus for every single investment, which is typically a 220 to 280 page document prepared by the sponsor. But that's going to provide an overview of all of the key components and attributes associated with the investment. Additionally, all of the due diligence source files at the sponsor level, so everything that we are reviewing, they can also review. And we're talking about the original purchase and sale agreement, loan terms, insurance policies, property condition report, the legal entity trust structure itself, all of that, financial projections, of course, all of that is there for them. So they can review source documents. When we pull third-party reports like these axiometric reports, or I had showed the real capital analytics and Oxford economics and CoStar data a little bit earlier, all those reports that we're pulling, we can share. The one thing that we can't share is when we synthesize all of that into our spreadsheets and are comparing and contrasting properties from one another, and then stress testing financial projections, saying, what if we say occupancy goes up 3% or down 8%? What does that do? That scenario analysis, and where we start putting our hypothetical situations and our opinions on top of it, that's what we can't share.
And that's maybe kind of part of the secret sauce too. If you were to share that, someone could duplicate what you do.
Yes, I mean, that's a valid point. I don't know that they would necessarily, even with the files, know how to or have access to the information to do it. But some may be able to if they came from an institutional real estate world. But these subscriptions are expensive too. I mean, that's a big barrier to entry. And some of the reports are a couple $100s per report, or annual subscriptions could be $15,000-$20,000. So there's a lot of data behind there that these companies that are aggregating that data, they spend and invest a significant amount compiling it, and then in turn they charge us a lot for it as well. But we don't pass that cost along to investors by any means. That's just part of our service offering.
Great. Hey, we appreciate your time.
Excellent. Always a pleasure to share with the community, and great to see you as well, Jeff. I like that Patriot tie there.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm busting it out before July, but
Excellent. Well, Memorial Day is right around the corner, so
that's right.
It's never too early for that.
All right. Hey, thanks again, and thank you, everybody. And remember, this afternoon we have the other live stream, and I think that'll be really good about earthquake insurance and why you would need that. And I bet you all those properties have earthquake insurance.
If it's in an area.
Oh, I guess maybe not, though. It's not in California, huh?
But sometimes it's tornado, sometimes it's hurricane. Every part of the country has some sort of natural disaster exposure to it. It's not necessarily going to happen, but exposure. So
that's right. Okay, great. Thanks again. Take care.
Yeah, have a good one.